Hey everyone, welcome to the Joomla Chat conference. I'm delighted to have Marc with us today. Marc is talking about how you can much more efficiently create overrides and alternate layouts for your Joomla sites. It used to be that an override was a complex task of finding the right file, moving it to your template, modifying it, and going through all sorts of different hoops. But Marc is going to take an approach using CSS Grid, which, well, we wrote a book on it last year and ended up publishing about 40 different blog posts on it. CSS Grid is awesome, and it's going to be increasingly integrated in Joomla 4. So if you don't take away anything else from this presentation, know that you're going to have to pay attention to the CSS Grid part, because increasingly it's going to become a key part of Joomla's future. Marc, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Actually, you've said everything, basically. I will add your book in my resources. I added a slide this morning with a few useful links, and I forgot that one. So this presentation can be found on my website together with all the other presentations I've already made, mainly around custom fields, because I'm the #1 fan in the world of custom fields, right? So this presentation here is making CSS-only override. So I'm using the word override. Of course, technically, it will not be an override. But so all the slides can be found on slides.woluweb.be. So did I already tell someone here that I love Joomla and that Joomla is so powerful, right? Of course, because of the custom fields. So I'm very grateful to Alan Moritz, who integrated them with Joomla 3.7. Also because it's multilingual. And I live in a small country, the same as Johan, who spoke right before me. So Belgium has 3 languages for only 10 million people. So multilingual is a very important feature for us. Joomla is also excellent thanks to user access management, access ACL, right? But also because of the possibility to make overrides. What Johan Janssens has just told us, that we would separate the logic and what you display on the screen. So it is exactly the purpose of the overrides, to say, well, I want a different layout for my page, a different layout or a different structure, whatever. So you can say very easily that you will present your page in a different way. So most of the time, you don't even need to know anything about PHP to make your first overrides. My very first overrides were basic, right? I will not call myself a developer. I know a bit of PHP, but I will not pretend I'm an expert, right? Not like Johan. So but actually, you can start with little things that you want to improve or to change in your layout. So just give it a try, because it's worth it. But today, and once you have tasted it, you will probably want to go even further and to make other improvements on your websites. And to make overrides, it is quite technical. So a first override is very easy. Maybe you just want to switch to the image and the title, but people will feel the first time that it's a bit technical, right? Because you have to change the view. So it's the HTML generated by some PHP file. And then you also have maybe to play with a bit of CSS for the styling. So overrides, I'm not speaking about CSS Grid to say, oh, now forget about overrides. Overrides are just great and allow you to make a lot of things. So here, to get inspiration for overrides and alternate layouts, just see those 2 websites, jover.de and Webonet, which are 2 websites gathering plenty of overrides, so that you have, you can just take the code, copy paste, and adapt to your needs. And there is even now, and why not joining them? There is currently a Joomla override challenge, so that every month there is a challenge to say, okay, this month let's make an override about, I don't know, a contact page, or about anything, article overrides, basically. So that was it about the real overrides. And now I wanted to speak about CSS Grid, because you can do crazy things once you get into it. So CSS Grid, if you go to Can I use CSS Grid, you will see that it is now widely accepted by all the browsers, right? Except for Opera Mini, I see, but okay, the market share is really tiny, I guess. So maybe a few years ago, you could still say, yes, but maybe it's too early because then I need a fallback. Now, basically, any modern browser accepts CSS Grid. And even more is coming, CSS subgrids, by the way. So let's take a quick example of what we will achieve in this session. So this is a little animated GIF that you will find in the presentation. So if you don't feel like going to CodePen, I give a link to CodePen so that you can play with the code by yourself. So as you can see, actually, this is the same page, but with a special layout. Instead of having just the title, then the intro image, then the text, and then the links, so kind of linear presentation. Here I've made a grid with 24 columns, but you could do it with 5. It depends how you configure it, right? So I made a grid with 24 columns and saying, okay, it would be nice to have some space and that the image is not the full width because then it becomes too big. And so maybe my text could be on top of the image, on top of part of the image, right? So this is what we're seeing now. And on top of that, so we have a basic layout that we want for desktop, but you could also say, yes, but on smaller screens, then maybe I have too much white areas, right? So maybe I want to change a little. I keep the same spirit, or I could even make something completely different in the layout. Like this is a desktop layout. Now, if you reduce the size, we are seeing now, you see on smartphone, I just said, oh, actually, just keep the basic layout of my template. I don't want a special layout. And with a wide screen like right now, I have an overlap and I have the links on the right, which are vertical, etc., etc. So this is it in one little animated GIF. But let's go into the details. Why would I play with CSS Grid instead of making an override? Actually, there are plenty of good reasons. It's very handy. First, because it's less technical, right? I think that in a few minutes or in 1 hour, you can know enough about CSS Grid to make your first layout, right? It's very easy to learn. Also, you can achieve, as we have just seen, quite sophisticated layout, like the people who make usually overrides with Bootstrap. They will use Bootstrap to say, oh, instead of having the image and the text, I will make 2 columns with image and text, or maybe the other way around, right? But here we can make even more sophisticated layouts. Also, as we've just seen on the animated GIF, you could have completely different layouts according to the viewport. So you can be mobile first, right? This is how I implemented it in my code. Actually, I'm saying how it should look like on the smartphone, and then for what needs to be adapted on larger screens, I would say, okay, in that case, put the image there, or make it wider or narrower, whatever. And fourth advantage, it will work no matter your template. Some templates work with Bootstrap or Bootstrap 3 or 4 or UIKit or any other CSS framework, Tailwinds or whatever. So here we are totally independent of that because, you know, when you have a website with Bootstrap 3, you built a few years ago, and today you want to refresh it and use a new template with Bootstrap 4. If you made real overrides, you will have to adapt your code because what used to be used for columns, the CSS classes have changed, right? So here it is much lighter to implement, and you're totally independent of the CSS frameworks. Also, like in many cases, and I was even surprised by that, when I made the example I will show in a minute, I was working with Asteroid, made by Joomla, right? A template company for Joomla. And I was building that on Asteroid, which I like very much. And then when I had finished, I thought, well, my few lines of CSS, right? I will just copy paste them to one of my old websites, which I made with Helix 3, made by Joomla, right? So it's a totally other generation. It was made a few years ago. Helix 3 was really great at the time, but now it's Bootstrap 3. It's old. I just copy pasted my few lines of CSS and I had exactly the same layout, the same result. And even, let's just assume that your template would be too different. The adjustment of the CSS would be very light to implement. Advantage number 6, it requires less maintenance, right? Because it's only a few lines of CSS. So when you create a real override or alternate layout, you actually fork the original PHP file. And this means that when Joomla evolves or your template evolves, there are bug fixes, there are improvements, etc. to the original file. Well, actually, you are supposed to revise your forked code accordingly, right? Which most of the time you don't want to do because you have no time. And last advantage, last but not least, as Steve mentioned at the start, Joomla 4's frontend is largely based on CSS Grid, and CSS Grid is becoming a standard, right? So it is definitely an extra motivation to learn it now so that you can customize even more things in Joomla 4. So as I was saying, real overrides and alternate layouts are still useful. I will still use them in some cases where I want to play with PHP and make special stuff. But if it's just a question of layout and rearranging my title, my image, my video, my text, the previous and next buttons, the links and all those stuff, actually, it is enough to use CSS Grid. How it started, actually, I've always been very curious about Flexbox and CSS Grid. They are similar at the same time and quite different, but I never had the opportunity to really play with it in my projects, except for little things like when you want, in the footer of your website, when you want to display like your sponsors or your customers' logos. Well, okay, there I would play with Flexbox and CSS Grid, but I never thought of really doing what I will show now in a moment. The first nice implementation I saw of CSS Grid in the Joomla world was one made by Alan Moritz, precisely the father of my lovely custom fields. And actually we can do it live. So I open his demo website. It is one of these extensions called DP Calendar. And let's open the inspector. So I open the inspector. I'm here in Firefox because when you play with, when you play with CSS Grid, Firefox is nicer than Chrome because you have nice little tricks that I will show in a second. So on this page, actually, when I inspect an event here, I see that he uses in his CSS, in Alan Moritz CSS, I see, okay, this event display grid, right? So the advantage of Firefox is that you have a little icon of a grid here. If I click on it, it makes the grid visible. It stays on the screen, right? Even if now I move on to other elements, it stays on my screen. So it's very handy to see how the grid is based. So actually what he did on this demo page, he said, okay, so an event for him is like an article in Joomla, right? In this extension. So this is a grid. And in one line, he says, okay, we'll have 3 columns. And each column will have the same width. It is 1 fraction each, which is 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. So it's a grid template column. Or maybe I should zoom on that. Here, right? So here we see there are 3 columns here in the code. And then he says, okay, on this grid, there are several rows. And for each row, of course, you can customize. You can say it's 100 pixels, or you want it to be automatic, or you can repeat so that you don't have to write 7 times auto, right? But once you have that, so if I disable that, actually, if I just disable the display grid CSS line, we see what his page is really like. It is titled, followed by the image, followed by some information, followed by the buttons, followed by the description, followed by the booking information. Actually, it's just a series of blocks on his page. But because he just wrote those 3 lines, display grid, said I want 3 columns and so many rows, then we have this whole structure, right? And then for each element, like the image, let's take the image. I go in the HTML and I will select the image. Maybe I could examine here, it's faster for me. So if I inspect the image, actually in the CSS, wait a second, because I've zoomed, so I've lost track of right. That's the header. Okay. That's the image. Right here. It was below because I zoomed too much. So the image, where does it show? Actually, again, it's just 2 lines of CSS. I've made my grid so many columns, so many rows, and I will say that the image, you will see that each column and each row has a number, right? So number 1 is the left border. Number 2 is the first column, etc. So the image here, I say that the image will start at 1 and finish at 3. It is what I see indeed. If I would change now that to it starts at 1 and finishes at 2, right? Then my image is only in the first cell. If I would say, oh no, I want it full width, then I could say it starts at 1. 3 was what I had, so 4, and now I have a full width image. And same from the row. So I'll put it back here on the first 2 cells. And for the row, I could also play with that, right? And say, oh, I want it to start before. So now it starts 1 row before. So it even comes on top of my title partially, right? Or I could say, no, I want it to start at 4, but go until 6. And it will be bigger, right? So for each element, the title, the image, the description, etc., he has just 2 lines. There are just 2 lines, grid column saying where it starts, when it finishes, and grid row saying when it starts and when it finishes. So basically, it's just, you already know everything you need to know about CSS Grid, right? There are subtleties, or you can do more complex things, but you have the basics. So coming back to the presentation here, a more advanced example is because here on DP calendars example, there is no overlap, right? Everything is nice. You don't overlap the image with the text. It was not the ID. So every element has a cell or a group of cells in the table, in the grid. But you can play further with the ID. And this is what I've made here on this website. So on this website, I said, well, instead of just having my title, image full width, and text full width, I would like to have something like this, right? Okay, I made an animation. This has nothing to do with CSS Grid, but you can even improve further. Like I use an SVG file image to clip the image so that it's not a rectangle. Okay, these are just little bonuses that I implemented in my CSS. But speaking about CSS Grid, it's the same concept as we've just seen with DP Calendar. So I have said that I wanted a grid, right? So again, in my CSS, I will zoom a bit. Maybe I will make this a bit smaller. No, it's not, it's here. And you see that my page adapts to the size. My grid adapts. All my elements are on the grid, but for each size of the screen, I can change that. Like for smartphone, for smartphone, I did not want to have any overlap between the image and the text because it becomes too tricky on a small screen. But the bigger the screen, then the more I can put empty spaces here and there. So I can play with the CSS to do that. So in my case, you see, it's the same idea. I have an item image class where I've said, okay, I want a grid. In my case, I've said I'll make 24 columns so that I can really fine tune and say, oh, on huge screen, I will put the image from here to there. But if the screen is a little bit smaller, then I will change slightly the position of each element, right? So it's really for the fine tuning. You could do with less columns, of course. And it's the same thing for the rows. So for some rows, I've put a fixed height. For other ones, it's automatic. So let's just take a few elements, like maybe you never noticed, but in Joomla, you have, when you create an article, you have links A, link A, link B, link C, right? I've never used them. And the other day I was thinking, well, actually, it could be nice when you want for an article to add a link to an email or to an external website, right? So this element is also a part of the grid. So, and I've said, okay, I also add something to make it vertical, as you can see. But I said, okay, I want it to be displayed on the last column of my table. So instead of counting from 1 to 25, actually, I can count reverse. So in this case, I will just say, oh, I want it to finish on the last column, which is called -1. And I want it to start one column before. So it's column -2. So here, if I would write, I want it to start it at -4 and finish it at -3, then it would be in another cell of my table. So as you can see, I can place any element anywhere on the table, whether there is overlap or not. If there is some overlap, like I have between my image and my text, well, I've just added a semi-transparent. In my case, I chose for a semi-transparent background for my text. So I still see the image behind my text, right, which is moving when I hover it as a bonus. But you can do whatever you like. So it's very handy because you have a virtual grid and you place any element anywhere. This was the website on which I was working, and I've made for you a simplified version because I did not take all the CSS. But so in the presentation, you have the link to this page on CodePen, so that if you want to fork it and play a bit with the ID and with CSS Grid, feel free to do so. You have something working. Maybe I should just change the title here, all right? Because it was the title of my website. So I will say Joomla Shack Conference, for example, right? So feel free to play with that and fork it. It was the idea because the website on which I'm showing here is not live yet. It is still work in progress. So in a few weeks or months, it will be visible and you will be able to inspect every code, every line of CSS on it. But right now it's not public yet. But what I wanted, when I had finished this design, I thought, well, what about trying that on another template, as I was mentioning? And then I went to this website, which has nothing to do. It's an old website of, I don't know, 4 years ago. I had an NGO, right, refreshing their website because they had issues. So it was not built by me initially, and I said, I will just copy paste my little block of CSS. So if you want to have an idea of the length of my CSS, well, of course, I have many elements because I have the title, the icons, the article info, the full image, the page. But basically, it's just like one page of CSS, right? It's just this little block. And I copy pasted that on this website. which is another template, another generation made by another template provider and another bootstrap version. So really, I was thinking, no, it's not going to work like that out of the box. But it did. I had to change absolutely nothing in my CSS to make it work on this old website. So it's very handy. It means that maybe on some between templates, there could be more differences than between Astrid and Helix 3, right? But even then, you would just have to rename in your CSS classes. Maybe on some templates, it's not called item title. Maybe it's just called div.title, right? But it's the only changes you would have to make. Coming back to the presentation. So now it's really up to you. You have seen the interest, hopefully, of CSS Grid to make as an alternative to real overrides or alternate layouts, since you can rearrange any element on your page and make something very nice. And I've added a couple of interesting resources, and I will have to add Joomla Shack's book about it. I also have a book, but in French, since I'm French speaking. Different websites, and the first one is really worth seeing because it is what inspired me when I said, oh, I would like to use CSS Grid, but every time you say, okay, next project, because right now I'm too busy. And then I saw this article about CSS Grid, how I design with CSS Grid. And it is very nice because actually the guy explains exactly how he created this design, right, for a concert or a rock group, whatever, where it would have overlap between the name of the album and the image and the button and some vertical text there and the read more at another place. And then I thought, well, I really need to dive into that and see what we can achieve with CSS Grid. So you should definitely have a look at this presentation because once you've gone through it, you won't be able to resist anymore. And you also have it on CodePen. So if you want to play with the code, you can do it directly on CodePen. Also, what can be very useful if you're a beginner with CSS Grid, or even if you're an expert, there is a tool here, which is CSS Grid Generator. Maybe, I guess it's this link, right? Where you can easily play with all the parameters so that you directly get your code and visualize how it looks like. So it's very handy to create your grid, whether you're a starter or an expert. Another famous website is Grid by Example. Here, where you have plenty of examples of how useful CSS Grid can be. Because here I was talking about presenting the elements of an article, right? Title, image, text, buttons, links, etc. But it also has other uses, right? Like the grid autoflow column. You see here what you can achieve when you want to have, I don't know, I have a website which I'm building now. It is not made with CSS Grid, but it could have been. It is like a little Netflix, right? And this is made with Astrid templates and without any override, and actually even without CSS Grid. This page is just made with CSS. So if you know a bit of CSS, be it CSS Grid or whatever, you can really do nice things with your templates. Coming back to the useful links, there's also a series of video tutorials, cssgrid.io, which are just free as far as I remember, totally free. And you have 4 hours of videos about CSS Grid. So it's really pleasant to learn it this way if you don't like reading tutorials or books. And in the future, we will even have subgrids, right? This is an article or a presentation made by Rachel Andrew and about CSS subgrids, and it will add even more things so that your layouts will be even more fun to create. So yeah, in 30 minutes or so, this is an overview of what you can achieve with CSS Grid. So without playing with PHP, without making real overrides or alternate layout. If you have any suggestion about this presentation, feel free to contact me. Here are my details, and I'm always happy to talk about Joomla and custom fields and now CSS Grid.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marc. Have you had the chance to really dig into Joomla 4 and the implementation of CSS Grid in it?
A little bit. So I'm not going into details, but like I've seen discussions about people saying like in Joomla 3, when you have the blog view where you display several articles of a given category, for example, you can say, oh, I want it in 2 columns or in 3 columns. And actually, maybe it has come back now in the interface of Joomla 4. I've not followed recently. But at some point, it had just disappeared because the template of CSS of Joomla 4 uses CSS Grid. So actually, it's just a question of editing one line of CSS to say whether you want 2 columns or 4, whether you want to go vertically or horizontally. It is all with CSS. Now, of course, for someone who has never touched a line of CSS, maybe we need something in the interface. That's a same debate to have, whether we need a button in the Joomla 4 backend to change that line of CSS, right? But basically, the whole Joomla 4 template is built with CSS Grid. So once you know a little bit, like after 15 minutes, you could already make crazy things in your Joomla 4 templates and websites.
Awesome. I think, although our template designer, Valentin, here at Joomla Shack has gone into this more than me, I believe he was saying that the front end is largely reliant on CSS Grid, which is almost things like laying out articles or laying out blog posts is the perfect fit for it. Whereas I think the Bootstrap 4 is mainly used for the admin area of Joomla 4.
Yeah, the backend is not using CSS Grid as far as I know. We are really speaking about, well, normally regular users, right, don't override their backend. They could install extensions or templates in the backend, but they don't touch the backends. So actually, it's CSS Grid is used more in the front end, but it's exactly there that you want to customize yourself and make nice layouts and make improvements to your websites.
One question from the chat: do you have any recommendations for someone that might be stuck on Bootstrap? Are there any ways to make a migration from Bootstrap to CSS Grid easier?
Well, actually, all the examples I was giving here, like this website, right? And then the other one where I just copy pasted my few lines of CSS. This is using Bootstrap 3. This is using Bootstrap 4. So it has nothing to do. Here I was using CSS Grid to customize the layout of one article, well, of all the articles of my website, right? Now, if I wanted to say, oh, I also have, let me show you, I also have, on this website, I also have a blog view, right? This blog view is generated by my template, which is Asteroid in this case, and they are using Bootstrap 4. So here, I have not changed. Here, they are just using the standard Bootstrap 4 col-4 to make this in 3 columns, right? And I'm not touching this. But it is more like for each element that I could say, oh, maybe I want to put the image of each card at the end instead of having it at the top. There I could use CSS Grid to say, oh, for each card, without even touching my template, which is using Bootstrap 4 actively to make these cards, within each card, I could switch elements.
So that's probably one of the big advantages of this approach you've described today, that it could quite easily integrate with just about any existing framework that you have.
Exactly. It's totally independent. So you can improve upon your website, upon your template, and make, it was the whole point of this example, right? Instead of without CSS Grid. Let me find back the right line. I'm here in item. Without CSS Grid, it would be this. It would be the image. Okay, I have a zoom on the image, but image, title, links, text, all full width, right? And just thanks to this little line, display grid, I have this unique layout of having the title and then how to say, you know, they are not aligned, the image and there is some overlap, and they are not aligned, this image and this text box and the links. So it does not even matter the order of the elements. Maybe the image is coming in my HTML before my title. I could use CSS Grid just to change the order of the elements. Only for that, it would be good enough. And now I take advantage of it to make something nice and to make more improvements in the design of the page.
It's a good illustration of why CSS Grid is taking over and becoming so popular for so many uses, including Joomla 4. Awesome. Thank you so much, Marc. That was really educational. And I know a lot of us will take away stuff from this that we're going to have to put to practical use really soon.
Yeah, exactly. And if you go to the link I made to CodePen, you will see that I made it mobile first, because it's also a good thing, right? When you're in front of the customer to say people want mobile first. They don't even know what it means maybe. But here you can say, look, it's mobile first. I just say how I want the layout to be by default on small screen. And then, well, I have almost everything there. And only for the bigger screens, I only change the place of the image. I will say, oh, let's make it larger, for example, and move it on the grid. So actually, for each size of my screen, then I adapt slightly the position of each element if I want to, of course. I don't have to. Maybe I could have a unique layout for all sizes. But like here, the overlap of text and image on a smartphone would probably not be a good idea. So that's why you can even make differences according to mobile view or desktop view. Any other questions?
Yes. Okay, this is my first time learning about CSS Grid. Does this replace the layout? Is there still a custom CSS file to style the page elements?
Well, actually, I'm on my website. I am using my custom.css file or custom.scss if I want to use a preprocessor, right? But I'm using my custom.css to add my CSS Grid thing. So I'm not even changing anything to my template. I'm just using the standard custom.css file suggested by my template to add my few CSS Grid lines.
Question, can you use CSS Grid with Flexbox?
Yes, I mean,
it's probably the same answer as before, right? That it will integrate with just about anything else that you're using.
Yeah, exactly. But of course, maybe if your template is already using Flexbox to the, okay, I don't know. Let's take an example.
Yeah, that was the question.
Probably Flexbox is used on this website by the template itself. I've not made that.
Yeah, that was I think the point of view of the person asking the question. I think maybe their template ships with Flexbox.
Yeah, exactly. Like here on this template, like on many templates, the header uses Flexbox so that the logo is left aligned, the icons there, social icons are right aligned. So it could be that Flexbox is used on my header and Bootstrap is used by the template on the block view. And at the same time, I'm just using, besides that, CSS Grid on my article view or on anything. What I use, for example, I take this website. If I quickly find the page, yes. On this page, actually, it's a basic Joomla contact form, right? With custom fields, because you can have custom Joomla native custom fields Thanks, Alan Moritz again. Apply to articles, but also to contacts. So also to contact forms if you want. So here I had a series of custom fields on this contact form. But the problem is that by default, Joomla places the CAPTCHA after the message and so before my custom fields, which is nonsense, right? When visitors come, if they put a title, a message, and then we ask some additional information, right? It makes no sense to put the CAPTCHA in the middle. It should be at the end. So maybe this is a little improvement that Joomla could make on this page, a contact form. But here, actually, I did not make any override. You can use Flexbox or CSS Grid. Both are equivalent for this. Just to say, oh, actually, this page has several elements. And I will just say that element number 20, which is the CAPTCHA, should come first. Or maybe the CAPTCHA was number 5, and I want it to be the last. So you could even use CSS Grid not to change totally the layout like I showed you in the presentation, but just to switch the order of 2 elements. Like here, I wanted CAPTCHA was coming before the custom fields. I wanted it to come after 1 line of or 2 lines of CSS, Flexbox, or CSS Grid, and it's done.
Awesome. And the final question we have is, can you talk a little bit about controlling the grid with breakpoints or screen size?
Yeah. So
and that question may have been answered a little during the presentation, but
well, actually, in the CSS, okay, I have a line just to say if the browser supports display grid, right? It's nicer if you do it that way. And after that, how do you play with the different viewports, the different screen width? You just have, it's a regular line command in CSS. You just say at media or at media screen or etc. And you say the minimum width or the maximum width. So you could say between 500 and 800 pixels, place the image in a tiny size on the first 2 cells, and maybe on the wider screen, put it on the right, on the last 5 cells, but of the second row, you could do anything. And it's just with this line at media that you have the breakpoints to say, okay, this is all I want. This is all I want for the basic view. And then for each size on top of that, sometimes I adapt it. Like I have an overlap here in my example between the image and the text, right? But sometimes the overlap, it would not look the same on all the screen sizes. So in some cases, I said, okay, at some point, I have to make more space between the image and the text or less space. So here for each size of the screen, I can adapt what I had previously said for the normal screen, just with at media min or max width.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much, Marc.
Yeah, my pleasure.
That is considerably easier than the way we used to do it.
It's a point. Now I've played with it and seen how easy it is, but still, in some cases, you need real overrides. Like if I take this website, okay, this is more complex because when the film is shown different times, I know now it's not there anymore, but sometimes I would reorder elements within for each article, or then I need PHP to play with it. So overrides still make sense, right? I'm not throwing away real overrides. If you need PHP to make some links with some other table in the database, or to reorder some elements or whatever, then make a real override. But if it's just for changing the display, the layout of the page with the current elements, you can do that with custom fields.
A purely visual override.
Yep. With CSS Grid.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much indeed, Marc. It was wonderful to have you. And got a lot of people saying thank you down in the chat.
Yeah, thank you to all of you for being there.